Okay, let's get started. Hopefully people will have seen that we're supposed to be starting at 6:30 because we'll be ending at 7:30. Alright, so let me bring up our notes and our text. Okay. Alright, so just to review quickly where we are in the syllabus. So tonight we're going to discuss the standpoint of the proletariat, part 3 of Lukacs' essay, Reification and the Consciousness of the Proletariat, in the book History and Class Consciousness. On Thursday, our next class, we will be reading Karl Korsch's 1923 essay, Marxism and Philosophy. And this will lay the groundwork, all the readings from this week from Lukacs and Korsch will lay the groundwork for our readings next week on Adorno, from Adorno, I should say. So if, because we have a shortened class session tonight, if there are things that we don't get around to discussing in the Lukacs we read for this evening, we'll carry that over to Thursday's discussion, because we'll see that there's a close relationship between Korsch and Lukacs in terms of their themes and how they're addressing things. Even though they wrote their works independently of one another, still they're kind of landing in very similar places. Now, there was one other catchphrase from Lukacs' phenomenon of reification that we discussed last night that I neglected to highlight. And that is, in capitalism, time becomes spatialized, and space becomes temporalized, and moreover, time becomes everything, and humanity becomes nothing. So what's meant by that? There's a certain kind of time, and this is something that we addressed in our readings from Marx's Critique of Political Economy, the selections from the Grundrisse and Das Kapital we discussed last week. So the contradiction in capitalism between bourgeois social relations and between the industrial forces of production, it's also a contradiction between wage labor, whose value is measured in time, socially necessary labor time, and capital, especially capital goods, machines, science and technology, which has a very different temporality. So it's the mismatch between those two temporalities, the time of human life and the time of automated machine processes, that drives these two sides of the contradiction of value of capital apart from each other. And that has the effect of collapsing time as a value. It's a really important point. So a crisis of time in society, the value of time. That's what we're really concerned with here. We're concerned with how time is valued, especially human time, including the time of human reproduction, the succession of generations. This has to do with how and why, for Marx, you can have this pernicious dynamic of an overproduction of human beings and the constant regeneration of a surplus army of labor that drives down wages. So Max Horkheimer, who we read on the first day of class, in The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom, in another essay that he wrote called The Authoritarian State, he said that in capitalism, machines were supposed to make human labor superfluous, but the effect has been to make human beings superfluous. So this is the difference between capitalism and communism, is that in communism, technology will be used to make human labor superfluous. But in capitalism, technology makes human beings superfluous. Now, why is that? That's not from any conscious, deliberate intention. That's an objective, structural contradiction of value, the value of capital in industrial production, in a society that's still mediated by human labor power as a commodity whose value is measured in time, or wage labor, again, whose value is measured as a function of time. The time of subsistence goods needed to reproduce labor power to bring people back to work, and also the time of human reproduction, the generations, the succession of the reproduction of humanity. Okay, so let's just keep that in mind. We can also go back to some earlier writings by Marx, where he also called attention to this. And the demands of the socialists in the 19th century, the demands of this new movement of the working class, this new social and political working class movement in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, is to demand two things: higher wages, to be paid more by the day or by the hour or by the week or by the month, to be paid more as a function of time, and also lower working hours, to lessen the working hours, to shorten the working day. So those are the demands. We might say those are still the demands that the working class makes in capitalism. And what that is a demand for a higher value for wage labor. Usually this is posed as demanding higher wages and lower profits for the capitalists. But for Marx, that's not the issue. The issue is not the profits of the capitalists versus the wages of the workers. The problem is the value of the wages themselves. And also, because profits are taken, in a certain respect, from the wages of labor, because it is a matter of surplus value accumulation. That's how capital is constituted. But the profits are really only meaningful as capital, not as luxurious consumption by the capitalists, but only as reinvested capital. And that's where the contradiction starts to manifest. What's the value of capital as investment in capital goods, in technology, in intellectual property, in machines, capital goods of all kinds? And the capital that's invested in paying wages. So constant versus variable capital, meaning you buy machines, that's constant. You hire more or less workers depending on market demand, that's variable. Also the contradiction between fixed and circulating capital. the capital that is already invested in either wages or capital goods, fixed capital, versus circulating capital, money. Okay, so let's just keep this in mind, that what the workers are demanding in their class struggle, up to and including the class struggle that demands socialism, that demands production for need, not for profit, and not merely collective bargaining demanding lower working hours but higher pay, higher wages. That these are bourgeois demands, and that this is bourgeois ideology, and that this is all based on commodity fetishism. It's based on the fetishism of labor as a commodity, fetishism of labor power as a commodity whose value is measured in time. It seems natural to us to adjudicate things this way and to seek justice this way. But in fact, for Marx, it's commodity fetishism because it is a naturalization and eternalization of something that is much more historically specific and, to his mind, transitory. And that points beyond itself. So beyond capitalism would be beyond wage labor. It would be beyond measuring social resources, capital goods, labor, as a function of labor time and time required to reproduce the subsistence of labor, the reproduction of labor power. So as long as we're in that world where everything is measured as a function of time, so time is money, for Marx, we will still be within capitalism. We'll still be within this contradiction because there's a question of what time is and what time means. Is it the time of human life and the reproduction of human life, or is it the time of automated processes, mechanical processes, machine processes, or we could say chemical and physical processes, like the process of producing energy in a nuclear reactor. These are different temporalities that are now tied together in a pernicious way. All right, so if we keep that in mind, that the working class is making demands in its collective bargaining over the value of labor as a commodity in industrial production, including minimum wage, laws about how many hours you can work, beyond which it's considered exploitative. Those kinds of demands, all the way up to and including the demand for a social republic, social democracy, socialism. All of that is, for Marx, necessary form of appearance, but bourgeois ideology. False consciousness. False not in the sense that it isn't real or true as to the current situation, but false only insofar as A, it naturalizes and eternalizes itself, makes it seem like at a basic level things can't be changed, meaning we must measure the value of human activity in society according to time in this way. But also false consciousness in the sense of a self-contradictory consciousness. Meaning these demands in conditions of industrial production are self-contradictory. And have self-contradictory results, self-contradictory effects in society. Now, why this is important is what we discussed last night, which is that when Lukacs is writing, he's writing in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution and also the other revolutions that failed to take power in Germany, Hungary, Italy, etc. around this time. Those revolutions came out of World War I, but World War I came out of, to their mind, to the Marxists' mind, a crisis of capitalism of the preceding era. And that is usually known as the imperialist era. Imperialism, Lenin described as, he wrote a pamphlet on it, the highest stage of capitalism. What had brought capitalism to its highest stage, to its highest possible stage, was the organization, the power, the economic, political, and social power of the working class in the advanced capitalist countries. But that had generated this crisis, this highest possible stage, they thought, of capitalism, namely imperialism, that drove a political crisis that manifested as international war within the global system. So the form of capitalism they were looking at was itself not only affected by, but really constituted, especially at a social and political level, but also at an economic level, by the success of the workers' movement, by the workers in their class struggle, the success of the socialist movement in producing these mass political parties. Okay, so the working class in its class struggle, in its struggle for socialism, but let's just say in its class struggle, is actually a driver of capitalism in this view. It's a driver of industrialization. It's a driver of capitalist development, but that development is self-contradictory. It exacerbates the contradiction. The workers' class struggle exacerbates the contradiction, doesn't ameliorate it, doesn't mitigate it, it actually exacerbates it. And exacerbates it even when it seems to mitigate it or ameliorate it through lowering the hours of the working day, increasing wages, and achieving collective bargaining capacities through labor union organizing. So the highest possible stage of capitalism could also be understood as the highest possible stage of the workers' movement, its class struggle, its movement for socialism, before it takes power, before it has a political revolution and makes a political bid for power to overturn capitalism. That's the situation that Lukacs is trying to address here with the standpoint of the proletariat. Okay, so let's see how he begins. He says, in his early critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx gave a lapidary account of the special position of the proletariat in society and in history. So that's 1843. As early as that, Marx is saying that the standpoint from which it can function, the proletariat, as the identical subject-object of the social and historical process of evolution, is as follows. Quote, when the proletariat proclaims the dissolution of the previous world order, it does no more than reveal the secret of its own existence, for it represents the effective dissolution of that world order. So the existence of the proletariat, according to Marx, as early as 1843, so after the First Industrial Revolution, during the commercial crisis of the 1840s, the global depression of the hungry 1840s, the proletariat represents, its existence signifies, means, the effective dissolution of the world order. What is the world order? It's bourgeois society. It's bourgeois social relations. It's a society of work. The Protestant work ethic, the triumph of the third estate as the commoners who work. That has been dissolved in capitalism, and that's represented by the existence of the proletariat, and therefore the proletariat, for Marx, demands the dissolution of the world order, of the existing state of affairs. So subjectively and objectively, this is what the proletariat represents. He says, the self-understanding of the proletariat is therefore simultaneously the objective understanding of the nature of society. So this kind of critical self-reflection or reflexive consciousness, the self-consciousness of the proletariat, when the proletariat understands itself, what its existence means, that is also the objective understanding of the nature of society. When the proletariat furthers its own class aims, it simultaneously achieves the conscious realization of the objective aims of society, aims which would inevitably remain abstract possibilities and objective frontiers, but for this conscious intervention. So objectively, society points to its self-overcoming, but proletarian class consciousness is necessary in order to make this a subjective reality. Okay, Lukacs continues. What change has been brought about then, socially, by this point of view, and even by the possibility of taking up a point of view at all towards society? In the first instance, nothing at all. For the proletariat makes its appearance as the product of the capitalist social order. The forms in which it exists are, as we demonstrated in section 1, that's the phenomenon of reification that we read yesterday, the repositories, so the forms in which it exists are the repositories of reification in its acutest and direst form, and they issue in the most extreme dehumanization. Thus the proletariat shares with the bourgeoisie the reification of every aspect of its life. Marx observes, quote, the property-owning class and the class of the proletariat represent the same human self-alienation, but the former, the property-owning class, feels at home in this self-alienation and feels itself confirmed by it. It recognizes alienation as its own instrument, and in it possesses the semblance of a human existence. The latter feels itself destroyed by this alienation and sees in it its own impotence and the reality of an inhuman existence. Now I want to say something about this. So property owning and the class of the proletariat, well, sometimes there are individuals who are both. Especially when we think of the essential property, the property of labor as a commodity. Self-possession, oneself as one's own property, inalienable rights, the inalienable property, namely the right to labor and the right to the value of labor. That's the working class in the bourgeois sense. That's labor in the bourgeois emancipation, in bourgeois right. But in the industrial era, it's also proletarianized. That means that the working class in capitalism can simultaneously feel at home in capitalism and alienated and destroyed by it. You could even say the same individual can feel both ways about it. So when we're talking about the class conflict between the capitalist and the worker, we shouldn't just totally attribute that to groups or individuals. We're talking about roles and functions and situations. Meaning, insofar as the working class can be considered to be property owners, which they are formally, They don't need to own things. They just own their own labor power as a commodity that they can sell to an employer through a labor contract. That's property owning. That is what property is, essentially, according to John Locke, and Marx agrees. But capitalism destroys that and produces a proletarianized condition of labor at the same time, because there are two realities coexisting. The realities of bourgeois society and the reality of industrial forces of production contradicting, undermining, outstripping, and destroying those bourgeois social relations and the bourgeois right to property. Most essentially, the property over one's own labor power, the right to dispose of one's own labor power as a commodity in a labor contract. He continues, it would appear then that even for Marxism, nothing has changed in the objective situation. Now let's remember that what Marx said was he didn't discover the existence of classes, nor did he discover their anatomy, the structure of society, or even the class struggle. What did he discover that was unique and original? The historical necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Also because others had discovered the dictatorship of the proletariat and had called for the dictatorship of the proletariat, but they didn't understand, according to Marx, from Marx's viewpoint, they didn't understand its historical necessity. They just called for it more sentimentally, meaning as partisans of the working class, as political partisans. They called for the dictatorship of the proletariat, but they didn't really comprehend its historical necessity in capitalism. They just thought it was right. It was desirable. They didn't understand its necessity, nor did they understand its possibility. Okay, so the viewpoint of the property owner and the proletarianized or expropriated worker, the propertyless worker, they see the same objective situation. Only the vantage point from which it is judged has altered. Only the value placed on it has acquired a different emphasis. This view does in fact contain a very essential grain of truth, one which must constantly be borne in mind if true insight is not to degenerate into its opposite. This is very important. So the vantage point, meaning if you're just looking at the injustice of the condition of the workers and making claims for justice on the basis of bourgeois right, then true insight might degenerate into its opposite, meaning it might degenerate into a kind of ideological standpoint or false consciousness, because it's all based on bourgeois ideology, commodity fetishism, etc. To put it more concretely, he writes, the objective reality of social existence is in its immediacy the same for both proletariat and bourgeoisie. But this does not prevent the specific categories of mediation by means of which both classes raise this immediacy to the level of consciousness, by means of which the merely immediate reality becomes for both the authentically objective reality from being fundamentally different, thanks to the different position occupied by the two classes within the same historical process. Right, so there's a further wrinkle, which is that, okay, the capitalists are going to be interested in preserving the value of capital, and the workers are going to be interested in the value of their labor. Right, so there is going to be some difference. They're going to look at the same objective reality. There's going to be this difference. It is evident that once again, he says, we are approaching, this time from another angle, the fundamental problem of bourgeois thought, the problem of the thing in itself. Wow, where'd that come from? The belief that the transformation of the immediately given into a truly understood and not merely an immediately perceived, and for that reason really objective reality, i.e., the belief that the impact of the category of mediation upon the picture of the world is merely subjective, i.e., is no more than an evaluation of a reality that remains unchanged. All this is as much to say that objective reality has the character of a thing in itself. Okay, so where is he doing there? It's what we talked about last night, which is that both the workers and the capitalists have a contemplative standpoint as regard the objective condition of society, the objective situation. In this respect, they both have reified consciousness. Both are alienated consciousness. So what he said earlier, quoting Marx, they both have the same alienated consciousness, but one thinks it's good and the other thinks it's bad. The situation. But it's still alienated consciousness on both sides, despite the fact that one is valuing it as good and the other is valuing it as bad. It is true that the kind of knowledge which regards this evaluation as merely subjective, meaning it's just the point of view of the capitalist, the point of view of the worker, as something which does not go to the heart of the facts, nevertheless claims to penetrate the essence of actuality. The source of its self-deception is to be found in its uncritical attitude to the fact that its own standpoint is conditioned, and above all that it is conditioned by the society underlying it. Thus, to take this view of history at its most developed and most highly articulated, we may consider Rickart's arguments with regard to the historian who studies his own cultural environment. He claims that, quote, if the historian forms his concepts with an eye on the value of the community to which he himself belongs, the objectivity of his presentation will depend entirely on the accuracy of the factual material, and the question of whether this or that event in the past is crucial will not even arise. He will be immune from the charge of arbitrariness as long as he relates, for instance, the history of art to the aesthetic values of his culture and the history of the state to its political values, and so long as he refrains from making unhistorical value judgments, he will create a mode of historical narrative that is valid for all who regard political or aesthetic values as normative for the members of his community. Okay, so what's the point of all that? The point of all that is to say that the workers and the capitalists agree on the values of the community. It's just that the capitalists feel that they are necessary and good and beneficial, and the workers feel that they are unfair, that they're getting shafted. But they're still agreeing on the same value system. One considers it fair, the other considers it unfair. We could say those who benefit from the system consider the system to be fair. Those who don't benefit from the system or for whom the system operates at their expense consider it to be unfair. But they are adjudicating that on the same value system. By positing the materially unknown and only formally valid cultural values, so the cultural values of the Protestant work ethic. Right? That's the shared values of the community, Protestant work ethic. Right? But those for whom it benefits feel that the system is good and just, and those for whom it doesn't benefit consider it unfair and unjust. And he says, however, this adoption of the values of a community as the standard by which to judge things, he says, this does no more than enthrone as the measure and the index of objectivity the cultural values actually prevailing in his community. He says, i.e. in his class. The arbitrariness and subjectivity are transformed from the material of the particular facts and from judgments on these into the criterion itself, into the prevailing cultural values. Right, so this thing in itself problem that he's talking about, the immediacy, the naturalness by which things appear, based on this value system, will keep us trapped within that domain of immediacy. Will keep us within reified appearances. that we can only contemplate. Right, let me turn to the notes and see what Grace, did you want to mention what you were calling attention to here?
I wasn't sure which ones we were supposed to read for tonight, so I kind of just made notes for both of them. Yeah, I kind of just made notes of stuff that caught my attention, like commodity fetishism.
Mm-hmm.
It's a specific problem to modern society / capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
I also saw this quote: because of his situation, a man's own activity, his own labor, becomes something objective and independent of him, something that controls him by virtue of an autonomy alien to man.
Mm-hmm.
Labor is born only in the course of the development of the capitalist system, and one man's hour is not worth another man's hour, but instead one man during an hour has just as much worth as another man during an hour, according to Marx. For part 3, I put the proletariat is also the objective understanding of the nature of society. I grabbed this quote: the proletariat makes its appearance as a product of the capitalist social order, and the totality of history is itself a real historical power. The author made a point to say it was the basis of their reality, factual existence, and knowledge. Immediacy and meditation are related and complementary ways of dealing with objects in reality, but they're also related dialectically because every meditation needs a standpoint that creates objectivity and immediacy.
Right. Okay, so here's a phrase from Hegel that is also taken by Marx and Lukacs, which is to say what is most immediate, what appears most immediate, is actually the most mediated. So everything that appears in a very matter-of-fact way, in a very kind of natural and spontaneous form of appearance, is actually mediated. Now, how is he trying to get at that mediation? He's trying to get at it through history, meaning what is the history that has resulted in or produced the way the world is now, and especially the way it appears now. So the way it is now, objectively, but the way it appears also subjectively. All right, so what is the history of our consciousness of reality? How we perceive things? What's the history of our subjectivity? But also, what's the history of the things around us and the way they appear to us? Where did all of this come from? Where did objective reality come from? But also, where did our own subjectivity on that reality come from? That it's all a function of history. Now, what he says here is that the totality of history is itself a real historical power, so let's think about that. It really has to do with something that I mentioned about the contradiction of value in capital between labor time and the time of machines, between wage labor and capital. Capital is the accumulation of past labor. It's what Marx called dead labor. So the power of dead labor is appearing in the form of, manifesting in the form of capital. In that way, it represents the way the past is acting in the present. Right, so you know the Faulkner phrase, William Faulkner, the American novelist, the past is not dead, it's not even past. So why is that? Because the actions of the past are still reverberating, they're still continuing in the present. Everything that exists could be considered the continued action of the past. So I'm sitting here in my high-rise apartment building in Chicago, resting on a concrete slab that's many stories up in the air, and so I am depending on the energy that holds the building together that was put into constructing this building, pouring the concrete, producing the steel, the rebar, and other structures of the building. All of that labor, all the physical processes, right, that past action is still present in the physical structure of the building that is holding me up, looking out across the city from my office in my apartment. Right, the past is not dead, it's not even past. The question is, how do we value it? How do we value that past action, that past labor, that dead labor? And what kind of claim on living labor does that dead labor make? Right, how are these measured vis-a-vis each other? How are they related to each other? Right, so history is present in capitalism in the form of how we value that past action. And we value it relative to labor time. All right, so the value of this building, its property, the land that it's on, the structure, has to do with tax revenue in the city. It has to do with income that people have in the city. It has to do with labor market, housing market. How much money can the building generate in terms of income, in terms of assessment values, in terms of maintenance, how long can it last as a physical structure. All these things are factored in, but the building would be torn down if people couldn't afford to make enough money to keep the building viable as not only a habitat for people, but also as property that can earn tax revenue for the city of Chicago to keep services in the city going. Right, so why do they build high-rises instead of one single-family homes? Because the amount of tax revenue that the city requires, they need these mega structures to generate that tax income. Right, all of this is a function of historical time, accumulated value, capital. Right, this building is a capital good, but it has to be preserved in its value by the earnings of wages in some way, either directly by the people who live here, or maybe there are some capitalists who live here, and so they have to skim surplus value off the wages of their workers. Somehow it's got to come from wage labor, the maintenance of the value of this building as capital. But really, the value of this building as capital, in another respect, is just the past labor that went into it. And that gives it a certain lifespan. I learned to my distress that the building was not meant to last more than 40 years, and meanwhile it's more than 50 years old. So when they first built these buildings, they assumed that they would not last more than 40 years. But of course, it's too expensive to replace them, and so they have to keep them going. And they have to really maintain them, preserve their value as capital, as property, in order to preserve the tax revenue that the city needs from this plot of land in this neighborhood. Right? So history is a real historical power in capitalism. It takes these kinds of forms. Okay, so in our last 15 minutes, I want to look at the end of this. So that's more at a descriptive level, we could say. It's more at a functional level. But let's get to the political level. Let's get to really the point of this article. We started out this evening with this basic point, but let's come back around to it. And that's to be found in the last few pages of this standpoint of the proletariat. Okay. So let's just look at the last couple of pages, and then we'll try to unpack it a bit. But we'll also take this up on Thursday. He says, still more important than these systematic distinctions is the fact that even the objects in the very center of the dialectical process can only slough off their reified form after a laborious process. A process in which the seizure of power by the proletariat and even the organization of the state and the economy on socialist lines are only stages. They are, of course, extremely important stages, but they do not mean that the ultimate objective has been achieved. So what's meant here is the dictatorship of the proletariat. And the objects at the very center of the dialectical process are not just the forms of capital, the forms of accumulated value, the capital goods, but also the forms of labor and the forms of class struggle, the forms of organization, the forms of politics that the working class has developed in its class struggle. So those objects are at the very center of the dialectical process and all take on a reified form. I think that I mentioned last night the reversal of means and ends. The movement is everything, the goal is nothing, which ends up imitating the idea that capital is a means that becomes an end in itself. That's the meaning of the term capitalism. But that also goes for the forms developed by the working class in its class struggle and in its struggle for socialism. So he says, and it even appears as if the decisive crisis period of capitalism, namely what he thinks of his own time, may be characterized by the tendency to intensify reification, to bring it to a head, roughly in the sense in which Lassalle wrote to Marx. So Lassalle was an important German socialist. He wrote to Marx. Hegel used to say in his old age that directly before the emergence of something qualitatively new, the old state of affairs gathers itself up into its original purely general essence, into its simple totality, transcending and absorbing itself back into itself all those marked differences and peculiarities which it evinced when it was still viable. On the other hand, Bukharin too, Bukharin, who was a colleague of Lenin, he's a Bolshevik, he's a participant in the Russian Revolution. Bukharin too, and a theorist in the Communist International and the Third International, Bukharin too is right when he observes that in the age of the dissolution of capitalism, the fetishistic categories collapse and it becomes necessary to have recourse to the natural form underlying them. Meaning, the basic fetishization is not just in the concrete forms of appearance in the world around us, but the value of labor itself. The contradiction between these two views, Lassalle and Bukharin, right, recourse to the natural form, the collapse, and recourse to a natural form, and also gathering itself up into its simplest and purest form, only apparent, he says, that there is no contradiction. For the contradiction has two aspects. On the one hand, there is the increasing undermining of the forms of reification. One might describe it as the cracking of the crust because of the inner emptiness. If you recall the passage from Adorno's letter to Benjamin we looked at when we were reading the Fetishism of Commodities section of Chapter 1 of Volume 1 of Das Kapital by Marx. He said, the perfection of the consciousness of the commodity inaugurates the explosion of its phantasmagoria. He says, their growing inability to do justice to the phenomena, even as isolated phenomena, even as the objects of reflection and calculation. So just in the ordinary function of the capitalist world, this is happening. On the other hand, we find the quantitative increase of the forms of reification. So even as they're going into crisis, he says, they have an empty extension to cover the whole surface of manifest phenomena. And the fact that these two aspects together are in conflict provides the key signature to the decline of bourgeois society. So the fact that these forms are in crisis, but that they're generalized more than ever. As the antagonism becomes more acute, two possibilities open up for the proletariat. It is given the opportunity to substitute its own positive contents for the emptied and bursting husks. But also, it is exposed to the danger that for a time at least it might adapt itself ideologically to conform to these, the emptiest and most decadent forms of bourgeois culture. History is at its least automatic when it is the consciousness of the proletariat that is at issue. The truth that the old intuitive mechanistic materialism could not grasp turns out to be doubly true for the proletariat, namely that it can be transformed and liberated only by its own actions, and that the educator must himself be educated. By the way, that's from the 11 Theses on Feuerbach, which we'll look at on Thursday because it's central for Korsch in the essay Marxism and Philosophy. The objective economic evolution could do no more than create the position of the proletariat in the production process. It was this position that determined its point of view, but the objective evolution could only give the proletariat the opportunity and necessity to change society. Any transformation can only come about as the product of the free action of the proletariat itself. Meaning not its action, its ordinary action in reproducing capitalism, as Horkheimer talked about in The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom, that all those who work and even those who don't participate in the creation, the production, and the reproduction of existing reality. That would be the unfree action of the proletariat itself. So what would be the free action of the proletariat itself? Well, that would be the attempt to transform this objective situation. But the means by which, the forms of appearance through which it's going to try to transform society are those same reified forms, namely labor and capital, meaning they're going to try to seize capital, emancipate labor, establish fair wages, fair and just value of wages, and fair and just labor time. Those are the terms, those are the categories in which this free action can only take place. So actually, the proletariat could transform capitalism, or it could be the last bulwark, the last defender of capitalism. And the fact that it can be either of those things, to Lukacs' mind, means that it's in this unique position. It's only because it could end up being the last bulwark of capitalism that it could possibly overcome capitalism. Now that has a real historical referent. And that has to do with the history that we discussed last night. So the crisis of Marxism, the division of the Marxist-led workers' movement for socialism around World War I, and especially around the revolutions that followed World War I, over the Russian Revolution and the German Revolution in particular. So why is that? Because the communists, Lenin, the Bolsheviks, Rosa Luxemburg, the Third International, the communists, who were they fighting against in the revolution? They were fighting against the other socialists. They were fighting against the representatives of the old Second or Socialist International, the SPD in Germany, which became the provisional government at the end of World War I, took power at the end of World War I, and the provisional government that had arisen during the Russian Revolution, which was also staffed by other socialists. The Mensheviks, the old-style social democratic socialists of the earlier Socialist International. So this division was a division within Marxism. It was a division within the working class. It was a division within the working class's own social and political organization. And both sides claimed to represent socialism. So that's the paradox. It turned out that the overall victory of the Second International or Social Democratic or Reformist Socialists against the people who were trying to make the revolution, the communists, saved capitalism. It created the conditions for continuing capitalism. Now, the later history is a little bit more complicated. We will touch on that more next week, namely the Soviet Union surviving in a capitalist world and the actions that were taken there to preserve the Soviet state in the name of preserving the Russian Revolution, but really conceding to the reality of continued capitalism in the rest of the world. So that's going to create some other problems that are not really fully manifest in 1923 when Lukacs and Korsch were writing. Okay, so standpoint of the proletariat is a contradictory standpoint, and that contradiction was most dramatically illustrated by the fact that these very parties, the parties of the class struggle of the working class for socialism, became divided in the revolutionary crisis, and one side stood for the maintenance of capitalism and the other side stood for trying to overcome it. And again, the fact that that happened to Lukacs means that actually the working class can overcome capitalism, since only it could really save capitalism in the revolutionary crisis. It's a kind of a return to the Rousseauian idea, which is that in our freedom we produce all the problems that we suffer from, but because we produce them in our freedom, we could overcome them in our freedom. So the fact that we've produced unnatural conditions for ourselves in which we suffer in society demonstrates our freedom, actually. It's kind of a paradoxical formulation, but nonetheless repeated here. Okay, so as usual on these Tuesdays, although we won't have this problem next week, this is the last time we have this problem, I need to end class early, and we'll take up some of these themes. We'll see how they are further elaborated in Korsch and his essay, Marxism and Philosophy. Okay, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.